What is the meaning of life? Why are we here? And is death really the end? I'm Dr. Jared Jones. I have a doctorate in religious studies and theology, which is in reality a doctorate in interdisciplinary philosophy focused on Tibetan Buddhism. And today, what I'm looking at is this final question of, is death really the end? A few years ago, I got to see a screening of a film that was absolutely mind-blowing because I had been following the research on which this film is based for a number of years. And you can see here below, Tukdam is the name of the phenomenon that's being studied, and it is something that occurs at the point of death, right? And of course, the researchers in the position they're in aren't allowed to make particularly controversial statements, but the phenomenon itself is absolutely astonishing. Absolutely astonishing. So, fair warning, quick trigger warning. There will be images of deceased people in this documentary. And if you're sensitive to those things, I'm not going to be earmarking where those images will appear beyond right now. There will be images as soon as the film starts of people who are deceased and yet are sitting up in a meditative posture, which is quite often associated with Tukdam practice. So what is Tukdam? This is going to be described in some detail, but just to give you some real insight into what's going on with Tukdam, I want to first set the scene. Let's set the scene. Tukdam is a practice in which a tantric meditator in one of the Tibetan traditions holds their mind in the subtlest state of awareness that occurs during the process of death. So as someone is dying, your 5 external senses stop functioning, your conceptual mind stops functioning, memory stops functioning, and according to the tantras, there are 4 very, very subtle minds that occur. First, there is a pinpoint of light, and then the first very subtle mind is as if you are enveloped completely in white light, and then enveloped completely in reddish light, and then completely enveloped in sheer blackness, just black. And then that sort of dispels or dissolves, and you're in a condition where everything is just completely clear. You can see here there's light coming through my window, but in this space here, there's no light. You can't see any light, right? It's completely clear light. And so sometimes they'll say it's like looking at the sky at dawn. But what they're indicating is that it's completely clear, open, illuminated space in which light is falling on no particular objects. And that condition is aware. So you are in that condition, but you don't have a body, and you are completely aware. And this is called clear light awareness. So tantric meditators learn how to generate clear light consciousness by turning off the 5 external senses and turning off the conceptual mind and triggering certain processes in the nervous system. And we'll get into a lot more detail on this, but they marinate in that state of mind while they're still alive through these practices. And then when they die, they hold their mind in that condition for some period of time in order to do Buddhist practice aimed at full enlightenment. Okay? So that's Tukdam. And so this whole research project that was initiated by the Dalai Lama, the Tukdam project, about which this documentary is based, is looking at this Tukdam phenomenon from primarily a scientific point of view. So the Dalai Lama wanted to know from a scientific standpoint what is going on with meditators who are clinically deceased, have no brain function, have no heartbeat, and are no longer breathing, and nonetheless their body does not decay. And their body doesn't decay, according to the tantras and the Tibetans engaged in these practices, until consciousness has left the body. This very subtle clear light consciousness. Until that leaves, the body doesn't decay. So just to set the scene appropriately, I want to do a bit of throat clearing about death and decomposition. So if this is a sensitive issue for you, I apologize, but we need to do it to really understand the full impact of what's going on with Tukdam. Okay. So first, there's a question of what does the normal process of decay look like? So this is a crime cleanup website. Their job is to basically clean up bodies that have begun to decay, and they're describing again, a lot of factors can affect decomposition, like temperature and moisture, and whether there are insects, and how sort of sanitary the environment is. But roughly speaking, what you find is that a human body enters rigor mortis, where it gets rigid, within about 3 hours. That peaks at about 12 hours. And then don't say it here, but then at about 36 hours, the body becomes slack and will droop. The clenching of the muscles releases, and the body becomes released or relaxed. So that's the first point that is unusual about some Tukdam practitioners, is that their body for days will remain in an upright, seated meditative posture without going through rigor mortis, and without becoming slack after rigor mortis, or during the normal time that rigor mortis should have gone away. The other aspect is, it doesn't say it here, but generally I believe it's around 24 hours where the body goes from being warm to being completely cooled down, maybe 36 hours. And one of the interesting things about Tukdam is that there is a sensation of warmth around the heart of the practitioner. And when you do tantric practice, you collect consciousness and what they call wind, which is correlated with prana or kundalini or chi in some other systems. The Tibetans call it wind, which is this sort of sub-physical substance that moves whenever your mind moves. And we're going to talk a bit more about this. You collect all the winds at the heart, and you place your subtle consciousness naturally goes to the heart when you pass away, before it departs the body. So when there is no physical heat there, which is part of the research they did, when there's no physical heat there in the chest, at least that we can detect at the level of the skin, when you put your hand over the heart area of that person, your nervous system picks up something that it thinks is heat, which is a very interesting tidbit we shall return to. So what normally happens when somebody is deceased and has passed away and they're not being preserved in any way is that within about 3 days, your internal organs begin to decompose. The cells that are making up the body, they start to eat themselves because they've run out of fuel. And then they start to burst and they begin to liquefy. And so within a pretty short period of time, the body starts to smell. 3 to 5 days, as the organs continue to decompose, bodily fluids come out of the orifices, and the body begins to turn green. And they don't say this here because it's pretty gnarly, but this is called the bloating period. So as as the body begins to decompose and bacteria producing gases, they're hinting at it here without using the technical jargon. The body actually blows up to about twice its normal size, like a balloon. And again, I apologize that this is so graphic, but it is important for you to understand how quickly this happens normally. So just to review, first the body gets rigid, and then it slackens off and it cools down. And then the internal organs begin to liquefy and decompose. And the body begins to emit pungent odors as bacteria and so forth begin to break down the body. And as those break down the body, gases are being released, which is what you're smelling. And the body blows up like a balloon. And as it's blowing up like a balloon, that forces fluids out of the orifices. And so the skin starts to change color. And then, as it says here, a lot of other things are happening. The skin can start slipping off, the nails and teeth can start falling out. Again, the body is starting to, at this point, between 8 days, 8 and 10, it's starting to go through pretty rapid decomposition. 2 weeks plus, the teeth and nails fall out, and by the time you get to a month, the corpse begins to liquefy into a dark sludge. So, assuming that nothing is eating all of this sludge that's being produced by the bacteria, like insects and so forth, then you end up with a sludge. So just bear that in mind, 30 days, okay? Now, so that's the first point. The normal process of decomposition, let's say all things being equal, if we are at a relatively, sort of, if things are not too clean, not too dry, not too hot or cold, this is the relatively normal process of decomposition, okay? So that's point number one. Point number two is Tukdam has undergone extensive study and is actually published in medical journals, okay? So this phenomenon of Tukdam is not just some religious thing about which we know nothing. There's a 10-year research program that has gone into studying Tukdam, and we know for sure because we're working with, or they are working with, neurologists and doctors who will be interviewed throughout the course of this documentary, that these people are definitely deceased, okay? They are in a post-mortem condition. No brain activity that, at least up to this point, that could be or can be detected. No heartbeat, no breathing. This is, for all intents and purposes from a Western medical perspective, a corpse. How long does Tukdam last? Now remember, we said that a corpse, all else being equal, should basically be reduced to a liquid besides the skeleton and some connective tissue within about 30 days. Some Tukdam practitioners can stay in Tukdam for 37 days. So, for example, this gentleman, who was a tantric master at Gyuto Tantric Monastery, which is one of the big, it also says it here, was one of the Gyuto Tantric Monastery is one of the big Geluk Tibetan Buddhist tantric monasteries. And this gentleman, Gelong Narangpa Gedon Sering, was a senior Buddhist scholar and an acclaimed tantric master. So he was an accomplished meditative practitioner. And he entered this state, which is actually properly spelled Tukdam with an H, even though documentary left out the H because native English speakers would call it Thukdam otherwise. So he remained in Tukdam for 37 days. Now, when I was doing my PhD research, I can't remember if I used his case study or another one to talk about this phenomenon during my PhD. However, regardless, there are cases where people will remain in the heat of the Indian summer, okay, in conditions, as you will see throughout the documentary, that are not entirely clinically sanitary, in conditions where there's no AC, there's no refrigeration, in conditions where a body should rapidly decompose and go through the normal process of, within 3 days, smelling quite bad, within 10 days, bloating up to double its size and being almost unrecognizable as a human body, and within 30 days being basically sludge and a skeleton, right? In particular because there are insects and other things, and there's no way to keep them out in the environments where these meditators are doing Tukdam meditation. So, quite often. So, in those kinds of conditions, they are remaining as if the person is sleeping almost, for up to almost 40 days. So this is really unusual. Really, really unusual. Okay, so having said all of that, we will now start the documentary. And hopefully I've set the scene enough that you have some sense of, what does it mean for a person to be in Tukdam, and what does the normal process of decay look like, and why would scientists be interested in this at all? Hopefully I've answered those questions for you. So let us now begin. So these are images of meditators
I've probably seen
in
several
Tukdam.
thousand dead bodies. But this was something that I had never seen before. I mean, to see a person being able to sit upright, completely on its own, without caving into their own weight after being dead for a day is something that will never happen.
If I just came into the room and sort of casually looked at him, I would have thought he's meditating. And I mean, he was sitting and his skin looked extremely fresh.
I don't presume to understand it, but I do know that this isn't something that makes sense from the physiology of a human body that I was taught.
In what Tibetans call Tukdam, advanced meditators die in meditation. Their bodies don't show the usual signs of death for days or even weeks. According to Tibetan Buddhist tradition, consciousness is still present.
So these are all images of meditators in Tukdam.
There's such cases. That's a phenomenon. So we must sort of investigate how it happened.
And for those of you who don't know, that is His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and he is very much aware of how these things occur from a Tibetan Buddhist perspective. He is himself an incredible scholar and practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism. Unlike popular opinion, he's not actually the spiritual head of Tibetan Buddhism in general, nor even his own sect amongst the Gelug. He's not the head of the religion. He is an extremely important figure in Tibetan Buddhism and I think global religion for a number of other reasons. But the actual head of the Gelug lineage of Tibetan Buddhism is the Ganden Tripa. That's the actual spiritual head. And then the other denominations of Tibetan Buddhism have their own spiritual heads. In any case, the Dalai Lama is recognized as a very accomplished practitioner and scholar of his tradition and also a number of other Tibetan traditions, and has been working with scientists for 40 years, 50 years, to try to understand what's going on with Tibetan practice and Buddhist meditation and these sorts of things. So even though he's being interviewed and sort of saying, we need to investigate this to figure out what it is, he already has an extremely good idea of what it is. What he wants to uncover with the help of scientists is scientifically what is going on here. That's really the question that he's asking.
An old monk has died 10 days ago, but his body is not putrefying as one would expect in such warm summer weather in the hills above Dharamsala.
We are going to see this body, just letting
By
you know.
entering a deep meditative state at the time of dying, some Tibetan Buddhist practitioners are allegedly able to arrest the physical processes of death. The monk's body is checked daily to see if he remains in the sacred state of Tukdam.
So to briefly comment on that, remember within 24 hours, the body begins to really in earnest break down. Within 72 hours, the internal organs begin to, cells are bursting, fluids are beginning to be released, bacteria is beginning to multiply, and smells are starting to come from the body, especially in a warm temperature that's not particularly sanitary, with insects and so forth there to accelerate the process. So this particular moment is being recorded, I think, at day 11, day 10 or 11 of this person being deceased. And so, this senior monk, his body should, by all rights, having been declared deceased 10 or 11 days ago, be now in that fairly advanced stage where the body has bloated to double its size, is, pretty grotesque. And as you are about to see, the body looks relatively normal. It's obviously not a person who's alive, but relatively speaking, it looks like a person who's sleeping or something like this. And one of the things that they're going to do is they're going to show a skin pinching test, which is one of the tests they do for Tukdam, where a person who is deceased, if you pull their skin like this, it loses its elasticity, especially if they've been dead for several days. And so when you pull it like this, the skin just stays where it is. But a person in Tukdam, their skin stays elastic until the consciousness leaves the body. So that's one of the signs they use. The other sign that he was discussing there in brief, I'm just going to move the camera down to show you this. So according to traditional Tibetan medicine, and they're going to cover this later on in the documentary, and I'll highlight this again, there is a system of channels that runs through the body that is sub-physical. So we have particles that make up the human body. This is recognized in both systems, in the Tibetan systems and the Middle Indian period systems. These are called dharmas. It's different than modern physics, but there are some striking similarities, actually. For example, both systems describe them as I think the term that they use in modern physics is 0-point particles, that they're particles that have no extension in space, etc. So that, again, some pretty interesting overlaps there, but it's not really the point. So you have a physical body. There is a subtle physical substance that isn't made of those particles that makes up a subtler body that you have. And there have been a number of research studies because this idea exists in the traditional Chinese medical system. It exists, as far as I understand, also in some of the Hindu traditions, medical systems, and of course it exists in the Tibetan medical system. And since it is so broadly recognized as a real thing, there have been research studies on this. Up to this point, we haven't been able to find some physical substance that correlates to either the subtle body making up this sort of interior architecture with channels and chakras and things like this. We haven't been able to find anything like that structurally. And then furthermore, there are substances that move through these channels that have many names: qi, shen in the Chinese tradition, prana or kundalini in the Hindu traditions, also kundalini or prana, or in the Tibetan system they'll also say wind, that there are winds that move through, something that is moving, i.e. wind, is coming through the system. It's also wind because it's sort of like, when you move your hand, you can feel the air is there, but you can't see the air is there. So there's this recognition that whatever this substance is sort of, it's sub-physical. You can't see it. You can't. But if you start to work with it, you can feel that it's there. So what he's saying is, as I said before, according to the tantras, when you die, all of the winds associated with consciousness, right? Because wind and consciousness, or the movement of the energy associated with the movement of consciousness and every state of consciousness, are locked together. They come together all the time. They're always staying together. So when you die, the 5 external senses stop, conceptual minds stop, and all of the winds associated with these things dissolve into the central channel of the body, and the subtle mind, with its winds, moves to the heart. And other winds from the other parts of the body also move to the heart. So everything collects here at the heart, in the heart chakra, not the physical heart, which is over here, but inside this energetic center of the body. And if you've ever trained in Qigong, or you've trained in any of these systems that have to do with actually cultivating these energies, you will know there's really nothing subtle. If you're doing these practices properly, there's really nothing subtle about these substances. Whether or not we can explain them yet scientifically, if you start to work with them, they are as tangible and real as anything else you can sort of get your hands on, let's say, inside your body. It just takes a lot more work to be able to get your hands on them. And having done some of these practices and had some experience with these practices, I can tell you, at least in my humble opinion, again, no idea how they work, but I know it's not electromagnetic energy because they've tested for this. And they've tested for half a dozen other things to try to figure out, well, what is this sort of substance that is being talked about in these systems? And they can't find anything physical. Now, what's really interesting about this type of substance, let's say, these subtler substances that seem to be sub-physical and yet still some type of material substance, is that usually for quite a few people, when you, for example, if you have some of this substance stored up in your body for a particular purpose through training, and you were to eject it into someone else's body, one of the things that they'll report very often is a feeling of heat, warmth. And one of my teachers explained that, well, when you put more into someone's system than it's used to, it's sort of like it's almost like it creates friction in the system, right? Because the system is used to having a certain amount going through, and now you've just increased the pressure, and there's friction in the system, and the mind goes, oh, this should be warm. Another experience people often say is that it's almost like tingling or electricity. So again, the way that it's experienced can be different, but as we'll see later, there's no physical heat there. So whatever is being experienced by the nervous system of the peoples that are, or the subtle body system of the peoples that are putting their hands over the heart, is not actually physical heat, which I think is actually a more interesting point than if there were physical heat. So in the Western tradition, do we have any evidence at all beyond what I've just sort of said anecdotally, and the anecdotes of thousands, maybe millions of other people that do these practices? Do we have something better than that? Well, yes, actually. So let me jump back over to this very briefly, because I want to stay on track with the film. But one of the interesting bits of research that's been done in the Western psychological canon is what's called body maps of emotion. And this is where a person tells a researcher, by drawing it on a chart, where they feel particular emotions in their body. And something that's really fascinating is, if you look at where emotions are experienced, they're largely experienced in a column in the center of the body that radiates out from the heart area. So Here's sadness in the heart area, radiating up through here to the eyes and so forth, up to the head. And same thing, surprise, here it is here, radiating up through the neck to the head. And some people showing it down here too. So there seems to be this line that runs through the center of the body, with the heart being a very important center of where emotions begin and so forth. Same thing here, anxiety. The clustering is mostly in the center of the body, with strong clusters around the throat, the heart, and the abdomen and so forth. Love, once again, the chakra system is an energetic system where there are centers in which there are large branches that come off and run in channels throughout the body. That's what a chakra is. It's a big sort of junction box where energy then is transferred to other parts of the body. Energy, where this substance that is associated with consciousness is moved around the body. So you can see in the love diagram, for example, that you have 3 very, very strong centers, but the cluster is once again mostly running through the center. See here in the throat, big one in the heart, smaller one here, and then around the sexual organs, which again, there are chakras down near the sexual organs. Same thing with contempt. See, you have a running through the center. So it's not universal. Shame, once again, running through the center. So there is some evidence in sort of Western body mapping of emotion, and emotions are a type of movement of the mind, right? And what is the Tibetan system saying? It's saying that when the mind moves, when the mind does stuff, when conscious states are generated, that there's movements in this subtler physical structure that is not made up of the particles of your body, and that you can feel stuff in that subtler physical structure when it moves around, right? Okay, so furthermore, there's a really interesting phenomenon called Tummo, right? Where there's a huge amount of stuff that's already out there, so I'm not revealing anything secret at this point. With Tummo practice, which is related to tantric practice, it is a completion stage tantric practice, so it's among the most sophisticated, most secret, most important practices in dozens of tantric systems of the Tibetan variety. It shares things in common with Taoist Nedan. It shares things in common with Hindu tantras and things like activating Kundalini. Okay, so these are all in the same family of practices. So in this practice, what you learn to do is you learn to draw this mental energy of yours, as well as the physical energy of yours, and you pool it all in the lower abdomen. Yeah? So you pool it into the lower abdomen, and then you compress it and make it more tangible, you give it more substance. And then you hold that there through mental effort. You hold that compressed substance there, you draw more in and you compress it again. And then you hold that there, and then you draw more in and you compress it again. And so you continue to compress and compress and compress and compress. And this eventually is expressed as physical heat, in addition to the sensation of heat, sort of psychologically or in your nervous system. The body actually begins to warm up. And this has been so fascinating because it's one of these mind over matter things, right? This has been so fascinating to Western institutions and Western scientists that there's been a fair amount of research on Tummo practice. So what's really interesting is this. Actually, what is meant to happen with Tummo is you squeeze a whole bunch of energy over and over and over and over again. You squeeze a whole bunch of this substance associated with consciousness, at least, there's a whole bunch of them, but some of them, into this space in the lower abdomen where one of the chakras is located. When it becomes compressed to a certain point and refined to a certain point, because if you just compress a bunch of stuff that's actually not beneficial, then you just, it causes problems. So you're compressing good, refined stuff. Then it shoots up through the central channel of the body and sort of detonates inside your skull, and then it drips back down and you have a sensation of tasting something sweet, for example, and it drips back down through the system, and then you store it in the lower abdomen again. So there are practices like this, okay? And again, I'm not saying anything secret here. This is all out in the open now. I'm not giving you any specific techniques or instructions on how to do this. I'm just trying to clear away some misunderstandings people may have. So when you do these kinds of practices, you will gain naturally the ability to move this substance that you have compressed in the lower abdomen around your body and to do other things with it. And if you intentionally try to move it outside the body, other people can feel it. And when other people feel it, what they feel is usually a sensation of warmth or sort of a tingling, electrical kind of feeling. So again, there is from experience at least, from a subjective point of view, there is some type of sub-physical substance that seems to be there, stored in these energy centers in the body that are also used by the emotions, according to, sort of roughly speaking, according to the Western psychological canon. So this is quite interesting. So why do you do Tummo practice? Well, you do Tummo practice because you're trying to trigger these very subtle types of consciousness that normally only occur at the time of death. So if you do Tummo practice properly in the context of training in a whole tantric system, you can trigger these very subtle minds that occur at the time of death, then hold the mind in a state of concentration on the subtlest one, clear light, and then you can do practice like this while you're still alive. And then when you die, you can hold your mind there again in the sort of full-on, full-blown natural version of clear light mind. And this is one of the ways that you can make a great deal of progress, they say, towards Buddhist enlightenment. So it's important to note as we go forward that when they say they feel heat around the heart center, that it's heat associated with the winds gathering at the heart, not necessarily physical heat. Furthermore, I think it's important to note that Tukdam exists in an ecosystem of other practices that are of a similar kind, okay? So, for example, these are images from Powa practice, related to Powa practice, where through doing these visualization exercises and moving these sub-physical, slightly less than material substances through the body, where through those practices you actually develop a tiny hole in the top of your skull, about here on the back third of your skull. Now, the reason, well, it's actually kind of I don't know. I probably shouldn't laugh about these things because I actually think, again, I think they're real. I think they're real things. But one of the things they do if you're training in Powa hardcore in retreat is when this tiny hole appears in the top of the skull through doing all these practices and building up pressure, and basically you're making an exit point for your consciousness to use later on when you're done with this life, right? So that you can eject from the top of the skull and do this very deliberately rather than just sort of going wherever your mind happens to go. So when you're doing these Powa practices, they put a piece of straw in the little hole that develops at the top of the skull during the practice to stop your mind from jumping out of the body when you don't want it to. And then eventually you take that out of there and you just stop your practice at a certain point and don't eject the consciousness, even though you're capable of it. And so there are actually now a number of skulls that we have from practitioners who have done these practices and do physically have a skull at the top. I mean, do actually physically have a hole at the top of their skull. So it's not just like a visualized hole or something, right? Another related practice is the rainbow body phenomenon. And I'm showing you an academic article here because I want you to see that, again, these are not just sort of random religious beliefs. There's actual published research on these things. Rainbow body is even more rare than Tukdam. Tukdam is not something that everyone does at the end of their life if you've done Tantra, and neither is rainbow body. Rainbow body is basically roughly, very, 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 very roughly speaking, a practitioner who enters a state, in my understanding, that is like Tukdam. And if somebody's more familiar with these practices than I am, please do correct me. But my understanding is they enter a state similar to Tukdam, and then in that state, or immediately following that state, they do practices to dissolve the physical body that they came into this lifetime with. And if you look up rainbow body, there are some, again, because it's quite rare and a difficult thing to do, if you look up this practice, there are some images, again, where these practitioners are deceased, they're sitting up in meditation, and they have photos, at least, of their body getting smaller and smaller and smaller until there's very little left, or in the most profound sort of practices of rainbow body, all that's left is the hair and the fingernails. And the reason those are left over is because that's dead tissue. Anything that was still living tissue at the time of death gets dissolved through the force of this practice. So there, again, there's a whole family of practices here that are really, really fascinating and could be open to study. And there's a whole nother documentary about rainbow body, but unfortunately they weren't able to find a practitioner who was doing it during the course of the filming of the documentary. So spoiler alert. But we do have images of this, and these are well attested by, basically practitioners who don't have a reason to lie about it. So again, quite interesting. So what is the point in sharing all of that with you? The point in sharing all of that with you is relatively simple. I just want to give you the sense that, once again, these are things that have some scientific study behind them. They do, of course, exist at the fringes of science right now, because we don't, frankly, in my opinion, and this is shared by a few others, we don't quite have the tools necessary to study what's going on here yet. But let's continue with the documentary, and I can comment more as we go. Yes, but the point was that we do have some little tastes here and there of evidence and descriptions and things that do match what we're talking about here. Again, if you do Tummo and you do compress these, what for you are going to be internally, subjectively tangible substances, and you compress them into the lower abdomen, these things do occur where you feel stuff moving up to the head, that you feel stuff dripping down, you do taste a sweet substance, blah, blah, blah. These physical signs do occur. There's a bunch of research on Tummo increasing body temperature. Scientifically, we know that really does happen. So we have some evidence for this. In terms of Powa, same thing. People do develop a hole in the top of their skull when they do Powa. And in terms of rainbow body, it's still an open question in terms of research. We don't have, it'd be fantastic to have that all on camera somewhere, but we do have some photographic evidence of practitioners doing rainbow body practices. So there's this whole host of practices that are actually open to scientific study. And when you look at things like body mapping and Tummo, Powa, all in combination, you get a sense that, okay, there really is something going on here. We haven't put our finger on it as scientists and researchers yet, but there's definitely something going on here that is unusual. A person shouldn't be able to sit for 37 days as a corpse without decomposing in the heat of the Indian summer. And what the practitioners are saying is, the reason they can do this is because consciousness hasn't left, and they have collected a lot of the winds in a particular place. And those winds are collected because when you put your hand there, just like if you're doing Qigong practice or these other things where you're moving energies around the body, when you put your hand there, you feel warmth, right? So this is the sort of argument that I'm trying to put together to help you digest a little bit, in the same way that I've digested these ideas for years, what we are about to see.
Tukdam juya tanga su tangbo ha koi mindo. Ane dende che ane tangi koya to imba. Ane di dok de yakote do hoi di sha da kwa. Ane ta tangbo ta jo di dende che do. Ane dende dena ane tukdam ju mindo dende dena. ane di ki kwatang dende dodoi do ne tha de ane di yakbo de ane thukdam ju re lai do ane lama de takcha che ane thuksam ju tu lai do ane dirin thukdam la ju na dan dirin na nima chukchik taw che nima chukchik che ya
With the support of the Dalai Lama, a team of scientists has for the first time been given permission to study Tukdam. Anthropologist Dylan Lott is the manager of the Tukdam project in India. He leads a cross-cultural, multidisciplinary team working in the Tibetan resettlement communities of India.
This particular retreatant was known to one of the doctors on our team while he was alive, and so he was amazed how much healthier he looked after his death. And this was another instance where there's no fan, there's no AC, it's a mud floor, a few robes and scarves to adorn the body, but we were permitted to do inspections of the full body, both morning and evening, and to record the data that we needed, which was spaced around the rituals that were being done in the room.
Mm-hmm. The skin just still has such amazing integrity.
Mm-hmm.
That should not be. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, slowly.
Just quickly, it's noteworthy that when a person is in Tukdam, the 5 external senses have turned off completely. The ordinary human mind is gone. You know, clear light mind is not the ordinary human mind in any way, really, besides the fact that they are both conscious. They're both states of awareness. The entire personality of that person, besides some very subtle predispositions, are not present. And so, you know, pinching their arm or so forth, these things wouldn't be noticed by that person in that condition.
The Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison has been at the forefront of research into meditation, mindfulness, and healthy emotions. Its Tukdam project is the first scientific investigation into the phenomenon. The project is headed by neuroscientist Richard Davidson, some years ago named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world.
How important is the color?
Yeah.
We don't really know the answer to that.
No.
That's an important question to ask the forensic experts.
Okay.
Anything else?
He was suggesting that we begin to look at the amount of antibiotics that they've been given and whether or not they've had meals within 8 hours of their dying, because that's going to affect decomposition greatly. So we need to start gathering that information.
And how many Tukdam cases are there?
We have a total of 12 that I think where we have a good number of days post-mortem.
What would be ideal is before you left for India, if we had a file that contained images of all the 12 practitioners twice a day with the indication of the number of days post-mortem that the image was taken, the time of day, and the ambient temperature of the room.
Yeah, that would certainly be ideal.
If we use the standard, and I would say relatively superficial criteria of modern Western medicine, I think we can say they're clinically dead. We can say that their brain is showing a flat line, that there's no heart rate. We confirm that with EKG, and there's no breathing. That we can say, but whether we can say that there's no brain function, no, we cannot say that. We don't know that yet. One of the reasons why we're doing the work we're doing is to determine if there may be some more subtle kind of brain activity that is responsible for the signs of Tukdam. The fact that you see a flat line does not necessarily mean that the entire brain is dead.
Yomitarals kapdi de kung sosor jawa shuju tekap sangme charu nyangje ki tunju roram tukji che shu ngojor tus kade pota exam ne chilo nidong chungi dawa chukchik se nisangi nilas mozo di lega di go di thoma gozuga chiga jidong gu edikas nidong chungi lonire nidong chungi loni teji 양고 도담 중에 이제 니즈 중선아 양고 냠치 가래디 신주체기 니즈 고도 주부라 그것도 이제 니스도 그거래 대단히 공도 나올라 아니 냠렘바 아니 냠렘바 이다 결하기 냠뉴지 숨고라 이상만 먼저 이자 이날 막고식으로
이게 다 주로서 단자때 지하다는 메디 공단 소마 단자가 되는 거 근육가 이송와 하때 제도는 메디 공단자다 다 간체는 많이 도담 대한테 걸어와 때리도
그래 도담 어서지 부담들이 주에 갈라때 풍부디 때 소문을 신에 두고 와. 지게 벌라 니주 싸워 쉬우지래. 당고 셰바 그런 레바다 그저 저와 샤사로 레바 매와 샤스는 그 셰바 매 콘스 켈리데 주고 와.
진짜 갖고서 그 뒤주는 거는 다 오케이 사는서 다 시사르다. 다 먼저 된 이거 지금 다 되게 제려.
So one of the things that they're doing here is they're building profiles of meditators they anticipate will enter Tukdam after death. And with the help of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's office authorizing these great practitioners who would otherwise just, kind of leave me alone, let me teach my students, and, no need to do all this. But at the urging of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, have opened themselves up to do modern scientific research. They're building profiles of great practitioners who may enter Tukdam at the time of death. And then also what they're trying to do therefore they would be able to compare whatever readings and so forth they get in the post-mortem condition when they're in Tukdam versus their normal mind and their meditating mind and these sorts of things while they're still alive. So, what more is there to say about that? I think that's probably enough said about that for the time being. Let's carry on.
레반낭 레아 칸데 치기도 닝게 내단 칸데레도 디레 다이 지르 어디 주스 체가 생겨라 야야야 계획을 좀 보수 여러분 주제래 제가 본 야부 되게 좋다 시다 이런 말 와. 야부 때디. 사실 모두 비대로 맞지 배 있다랬지.
나랑 나발지.
예요. 자, 나 상황 되겠다. 자, 암전한 지금 그런 살.
the Tukdam project traces its origins to conversations that I had with the Dalai Lama concerning the relationship between the mind and the brain. And of course, in modern Western neuroscience, the mind is regarded as, if you will, what the brain does. I don't think anybody would deny that they are somehow extremely importantly related, but whether they should essentially be regarded as one and the same is a question.
So, just a quick point there, because this is really, really critical. There is a fair amount of research, there has been a tremendous amount of research trying to figure out how it is the brain generates consciousness to begin with. Of course, we have a huge body of evidence linking various types of conscious states and unconscious behavior to the brain. That's not the question, and that's not what he's pointing to. So there was this funny article I'm going to show you real quick. There was this funny article and this funny bet. So there's this. Let me see if they have his name here. There's this philosopher by the name of Chalmers. Let's see. Yeah, here it is. So there's a philosopher by the name of David Chalmers. Okay, and David Chalmers said, if consciousness, when you look at consciousness and the things consciousness experiences, and we've done this a bunch of times on this channel, it seems to have a very different fundamental nature than physical material things. Consciousness seems to be very strange and sort of made up of soft stuff that doesn't exist in the physical world at all. And so Chalmers made a bet. Chalmers made a bet with a neuroscientist that the neuroscientist said within 25 years we will have solved this problem of why it is that all this weird subjective stuff can arise, this soft private world of experiences can arise in relation to a physical world that doesn't seem to possess a soft private world of internal experiences. It is made of hard real stuff, right? So he in long story short, neuroscientist Christoph Koch lost this bet against David Chalmers after 25 years of neuroscientists trying to find the answer to the question of how the brain or neurological stuff in general generates consciousness itself, a private world of internal experiences. 25 years of hard work, they still have not answered this question. So, of course, I think people assume that neuroscientists has sorted all of this out. That's certainly how it's presented in popular culture, but in reality, that's not the case. Neuroscientists are still trying to figure out how the brain generates consciousness. And the Buddhist answer, and the answer of some philosophers like Chalmers, is that as well as there's been a huge amount of research into near-death experiences, and I'm forgetting the gentleman's name right now, but he has a really, really wonderful way of talking about this, where he says, that basically the brain is not what's producing consciousness, but the brain is involved with signals that consciousness is sending, right? This is called the mind-body problem. And when you look at thinkers like Descartes, where you have a substance dualism, which seems to be what Chalmers is putting forward, although he doesn't really go that far, I don't think. You're saying that consciousness is made up of one sort of substance that's very, very different from physical things that are made up of a completely different substance. When you visualize an apple, for example, I've done this on the channel before, you visualize the apple in front of you. If you flick it, you can hear it. If you bite into it in your mind, you can taste it. If you lean forward and smell it with your mind, you can smell it. If you reach out and grab it with your mind, you can generate a tactile sensation. And yet, this apple that you can see, smell, taste, touch, and hear, see, smell, taste, touch, and hear, yeah, that has all these interactive capabilities. Nonetheless, unless you want to put forward psychic capabilities, cannot be experienced by anyone else whatsoever. And insofar as I know, there is no macro level object in the entire universe that cannot be experienced by more than one conscious being at a time. So the stuff that consciousness does is like radically weird from a physicalist, materialist perspective. That it can produce images and ideas and meanings and so forth that are completely inaccessible to other physical beings is a radically strange thing. And the apple that you produced in your mind also didn't have to grow on a tree. When you're looking at it in your mind and it looks red and a little shiny, there's no light source illuminating the apple. You're not also visualizing a sun or a light bulb somewhere. It's self-illuminating in your mind. There's no air in between the apple and your whatever you're smelling it with, so you're not smelling particles coming off of it to smell it. There's no air in between that and whatever you're using to hear it, so when you flick it, there's no vibrations coming off of it going into an ear. So it's not located in any particular point in space. If you cut open your head, there's no little apple in there. Your brain is located in a particular location in space, but this apple, you cannot point to any location in space where it exists. And it has no mass. And so how much weirder is the thing that is knowing or cognizing this apple? At least that weird also, right? So Chalmers is saying that the mind is very, very strange from a physicalist perspective. Particles don't do any of that and don't behave that way. And consciousness does a lot of this stuff that's quite strange if you look at it closely and think about it. And so he made this bet that you won't solve this problem. And 25 years later, as of 2023, we are still in the dark as to how the brain produces consciousness. And I would argue, along with people like Chalmers, that we're not going to solve that problem because the brain doesn't produce consciousness. The brain is involved with consciousness, but it does not produce. It is involved with, for humans, the human brain is involved with human states of the coarser levels and probably also some of the subtler levels of human consciousness. But that's not all there is to consciousness. And what something like Tukdam is pointing out is that if you have sufficient control over the subtler levels of consciousness, then basically this could be used as evidence that those subtler states of consciousness are not associated with the brain, right? Because they're doing these brain scans and finding no neurological activity in the brains of people doing Tukdam in a post-mortem state. Now, it could be, of course, that we have a more sensitive instrument that we bring to Tukdam research at a later time and we find that there is some subtle brain activity. Okay. I mean, that could be also. But why it would be the case that there's heat around the heart center, why it would be the case that Powa practitioners generate a hole in the top of their skull, why it would be the case that the body doesn't decay, and what the mechanisms are for a person whose entire physical being has been deceased for 37 days can stop their body from decaying by somehow maintaining extremely subtle state of awareness in the lower basal level of their brain or something. You know, again, we're just so far from an explanation on this. So I'm not really presenting an answer, but I'm saying that I think actually a simpler explanation is that the brain is not consciousness. The brain is something being used by consciousness, but the brain itself is not consciousness. And the brain is not, even through its activities, what is making consciousness occur, right? The mind is not what the brain does. Okay, let's return to the screening.
In the phenomenon of Tukdam, there is said to be the presence of the most rudimentary form of awareness, which still occurs after the point at which they would be considered dead by a conventional Western definition. So if any of that is true, it would raise serious questions about the mind and the brain, and it would begin to introduce some problems in that conception. And so the Dalai Lama encouraged me to start studying Tukdam.
I believe that's Chalmers on the left.
We already have some kind of project to further investigation. We call Tukdam. After death, still body remain fresh. So we have the fuller sort of explanation. Mind, many level. Now this very moment, one seeks the mind very grosser level with.
Very briefly, for those not as familiar with Buddhist philosophy, there are 6 senses in Buddhist philosophy. We consider consciousness to be the 6th sense. That's where this idea comes from in sort of New Agey stuff. The 5 external senses are the first 5 senses, and each of them has unique objects. So your vision doesn't hear anything, your hearing doesn't see anything, and so forth, unless you're talking about some sort of edge cases, right? Likewise, consciousness has unique objects. So for example, when you visualize the apple that you're seeing with your mind, hearing with your mind, the tactile sensation you can feel of that apple using your imagination, let's say, that object, that apple, can't be seen with your eyes, it can't be heard with your normal ear, can't be smelled with your normal nose, can't be touched with your skin, and so forth. So there are unique objects for consciousness also, and hence it's considered to be a sense organ. Let's see.
5 senses organs. Then during sleep or dreaming, another level of mind. Then deep sleep without dream, further deeper. So when people faint, then that sixth mind further deeper. And at the time of death, because of the deepest, the sixth mind consciousness. So they took them. I already mentioned that. You see, the person who remain the deepest level of consciousness and with deepest level of subtle energy.
Right, that's the end of part 1. So just briefly, I'm going to recap a couple of things and then we're going to carry on. So notice how he said there, once again, from the Buddhist point of view, especially when you start talking about Buddhist tantras and Buddhist medical systems, there are various levels of awareness in which subtler ones don't go away, but they become impossible to recognize as you move up. Or they become more difficult to recognize as you move up, or they only occur under certain conditions. So what he was saying there, for example, is it's that dream, the type of awareness you have in a dream is subtler than the type of awareness you have when you're awake. And this is why it's more difficult to recognize that you're dreaming. During, I think it's non-REM sleep, right? Non-REM sleep, when the brain is not dreaming, when you're not having a dream and the mind is in a dreamless condition, that is even harder to recognize than when you're dreaming. But you can recognize that, and that's one of the practices that they do in Tantra. And then you use that for various purposes. And then he was saying that an even subtler mind than the mind that occurs when you are in dreamless sleep is a mind that occurs when you pass out, if you just become unconscious. It's very difficult to recognize and sort of be awake and cognizant, let's say, in that condition. In the same way that if you close your eyes, you seem to be seeing nothing, for example. But if you concentrate, you'll notice actually what you're seeing is darkness, right? You become aware that, oh, what's occurring is the absence of light. A uniform, if you cover your eyes in particular, a uniform absence of light. And that's harder to recognize than the fact that, oh, if you have your eyes open, there's all sorts of stuff, right? So in the same way, dreaming is more subtle than coarse sensory consciousness and your ordinary human sort of process of thinking. Dreamless sleep is even more subtle than that. Passing out consciousness, even more subtle than that. And then below that, at the time of death, or if you're doing certain tantric practices, there are 4 levels of mind that are even subtler, and the subtlest one is clear light consciousness. Clear light consciousness, the subtlest type of awareness that you have, is the one that moves from lifetime to lifetime, and it's the one that stores your karma. So it's extremely subtle. You know, this is not something that, like on a random Tuesday, you're going to experience. Quite a few near-death experiences, from what I can tell, don't arrive at this point of clear light either. They talk about the tunnel, a point of light, which is quite a far ways away from this experience. And then they talk about white light, which is the first one. Some of them talk about red. Some of them talk about black, which are the next 3 down, but very, very rare that I've heard a convincing description from any near-death near-death experience of clear light, which is the subtlest one. So Tukdam practitioner holds the mind in that clear light condition, doing certain types of Buddhist practice to make rapid progress along the Buddhist path towards enlightenment. Okay, and then what is also being held there is the subtlest wind, the subtlest energy that comes along with that mind, and it's being held in the heart center. And when a practitioner is doing this and has spent years throughout the course of their life building up force and building up the ability to generate this mind and building up a great deal of sort of tangibility in terms of this substance, when you put your hand over their heart, the way that that's expressed for you as a tactile sensation is warmth. Yeah. Okay, let's return to the film.
When somebody is Tukdam, means the person died in meditation. That person was doing meditation practice all their life. And their meditation has to be very deep and very profound. It has to be mind meditation.
Just quickly, Tai Situ Rinpoche is a very, very important teacher in one of the major lineages of Tibetan Buddhism. I believe it's either Kagyu or Nyingma, and is considered to be quite accomplished practitioner himself.
Meditation to recognize the nature of mind. So meditation, you become. You're not meditating, but you become the meditation. And at that moment, then your body remains in a very unusual state, just like alive. And mind goes into perfect state of meditation.
To briefly comment on that, because there's just so much he said that needs to be unpacked there. Very, very brief, I promise. So he said, when you enter into this, if you've been meditating all your life and you've been doing these tantric practices and you have gained experience resting the mind in its own most fundamental nature, right? This subtlest aspect of mind, clear light, is the mind's subtlest, most foundational nature. So if you've gained experience resting the mind in that condition, that state of awareness is also infused with selflessness from a Buddhist perspective. It's infused with this philosophical idea of emptiness. So when you rest in this state of awareness, your mind is resting in its most fundamental condition and its most fundamental nature. So this fundamental condition meaning the most basal, the most foundational condition of awareness, because this is the subtlest type of cognition that you have, and also its nature. So it also, that mind understands its own way of existing, which is to be a dependent arising, and therefore to be empty of not being a dependent arising. And so in that condition, you're not actually meditating in a traditional sense. You are simply existing in the way that your fundamental nature is. So should begin to sound a bit like Zen, and it starts to sound very mystical, even though it's not, right? It's the meditation of non-meditation. You're not doing something in that condition. You've gained enough control to abide in that condition long enough to cognize and be aware of and exist as what you already are, which is incredibly profound. And he says, when you've gained this ability at the time of death, then unusual things happen to your body. Your body stays fresh until the mind leaves. So just very briefly, I wanted to point to this overlap between the Rolls Royce of Tibetan Buddhist tantric practice, resting in the nature of your own fundamental conscious awareness without doing anything, without altering it, without needing to add anything, without needing to take anything away. You simply abide in that nature, being aware of how that fundamental nature of awareness you abide in that fundamental nature of awareness while being aware of how it exists. That's it. Simply doing that pushes you further towards full awakening. And then there's other practices you do after you leave that condition if you haven't finished the process. So, really incredible overlap there, I think, between these practices and something you might see in Chan or Zen, where the goal is to simply sit and exist and be in the fundamental natures of the different types of consciousness that you have. So I think there's a pretty profound overlap there. Now, whether or not Zen practitioners end up in a clear light condition during their ordinary meditative practices, I can't say. I have some suspicion that they might, based upon overlaps of what I have seen of Dzogchen practice and Chan practice and Zen practice and how they actually practice. Whether or not they do, I can't say. But certainly, at least at the level of, let's say, human awareness, which, as the Dalai Lama said, is several layers up here, right? You're at the level of conscious human awareness. If you're resting in the sixth consciousness at the level of ordinary human awareness, the experiences you can have there, some people that did retreat with me recently will let you know, the experiences that you can have just resting on consciousness and closing down the 5 external senses a little bit are very, very profound. Okay, let's carry on.
Tenga Rinpoche is a very senior master, so when he was in Tukdam, it is not a surprise. He will be in Tukdam because he's Tenga Rinpoche.
Tenga Rinpoche was the abbot of Benchen Monastery. With both legs amputated due to diabetes, Rinpoche was in such a bad state before he died that he could barely sit up. In the end, he died sitting in Tukdam and remained in the state for more than 3 days. This is a common duration for Tukdam and matches the Tibetan idea that a subtle aspect of mind may stay in the body for up to 3 days after death. In rare cases, Tukdam can even go on for weeks. Vanessa Lopes is a mortician from New York City. At the time of Tenga Rinpoche's death, she was in Kathmandu helping to preserve remains of Westerners who had died in mountaineering accidents. Rinpoche's followers invited her to check the body in Tukdam.
So, important note there, really advanced practitioners who use Tukdam during their transition out of this lifetime quite often have a shorter duration. This is a kind of fascinating actually, but they quite often have a shorter duration in Tukdam than those who are less senior or less capable. So people who have a lot longer to go, let's say, on the Buddhist path to enlightenment, they will often spend weeks, a couple of weeks or up to almost 40 days in Tukdam. There are some cases, for example, relatively recently, there was a practitioner whose body never decayed. They found in a cave up in the Himalayas, and the Dalai Lama said, "Oh, that practitioner is actually still in Tukdam. He never left his body." Whether humbly, whether or not that's true, I can't say. But practitioners who aren't as capable, they say, will spend more time in Tukdam, and it's more common for them to spend a shorter time if they're more capable practitioners. As an interesting side note, so that we don't lose the plot, this mortician was given access to this High Lama's body as he was at the end of his, as he had already left the body. She was now inspecting it.
When I initially walked into the room, I had no idea that, there was a dead person in that room, because nothing sort of told me that there was. I looked around the room, and there was some monks that were sitting and they were praying, and there was a man at the end of the room just sitting in a meditative position. And so I thought that he was just another person that was there who was doing their meditation and their prayers for the person who had died. But then Tempa sort of pointed to me and told me, this is Tenga Rinpoche, this is, our teacher who has just recently died, and we just want you to take a look at him. And I was very shocked, because to me it looked like a person who was just sitting in a meditative position, and he looked pretty much alive to me. They told me as soon as he comes out of his Tukdam state, then we will be contacting you so that you can perform some kind of an embalming procedure on him.
There are signs for the ending of Tukdam. If the person was sitting, the body will slump, and the normal physical phenomena of death will appear, as if the post-mortem process has been stalled and is now released. For Tibetans, these are signs that the meditation has concluded and consciousness has left the body. After Tenga Rinpoche's Tukdam ended, Vanessa was called to embalm the old Lama.
I was pretty surprised to be able to see that his blood was flowing as easily as it was, especially for a person who had already been dead for about 4 days. The color of it would definitely change into a darker sort of color, and his was still reddish, like the normal color of blood. And the procedure went amazingly well compared to what I was expecting.
Commenting again briefly on this, consider that in the beginning, we talked about the normal stages of decomposition for a human body. Day 4, things internally should be liquefying, beginning to break down at least. By somewhere between day 3 and day 5, that body should begin to start bloating. The smell should be pretty intense by this point. If we're in the heat of the Indian summer, again, maybe even just like a normal AC room, because that he seemed to be in a slightly nicer circumstance than some other rooms we've seen in this documentary. That body should have been in a pretty horrific position. And for her to come in on day 3 and not even be able to tell that there was a dead person in the room is pretty remarkable, right? As a professional mortician. Another interesting point is when I've talked to my teachers about Tukdam, they have pointed out, or they have mentioned, that there are a number of different signs that will occur at the end of Tukdam. Again, one is this person's body was remaining as if alive, in some cases sitting up, for example, and then all of a sudden, remember, after 24 hours, the rigor mortis goes away. So it's not rigor mortis holding up the body at day 3 or 4. When they release their consciousness, when they exit the body resumes its decomposition process. So one thing that happens, it slumps. Why does it slump? Because maybe it went through rigor mortis and then it slumped, or no, there was no rigor mortis because of the process of Tukdam. We don't know. But as soon as their consciousness leaves the body, then the body slumps. Another thing is sometimes fluid will begin to come out of the orifices of the body. And once again, we know from the beginning that when a human body begins to break down around somewhere between day 3 and day 10, there's going to be fluids that begin to come out of the orifices of the body because things are beginning to liquefy and gases are beginning to build up. And so once again, the idea or the fact that these bodies have very unusual properties, they look as if they're sleeping or meditating or still alive, and then at some point, more or less, resume the process of decomposition is quite unusual. And it's also, I find interesting, that the Tibetans are aware of what the normal process of decomposition should be. And when that starts to show signs, they go, oh, okay, now we're back to relative normality here. Of course, this is a holy being's body, but now we're back to the normal process of decomposition. So we need to do, if we want to preserve the body, we need to do, a normal embalming or a Tibetan embalming or whatever we're going to do. If we're going to put them in a funeral pyre, now is the time.
Unlike Vanessa, Tukdam project scientists have not been able to look inside a Tukdam body so far. Blood and tissue samples could shed light on cellular mechanisms involved, but Tibetan concerns over disturbing the sacred state have so far prevented collecting samples. Instead, the project has focused on recording EEG brainwave data and documenting the body's physical state. This also requires great cultural sensitivity, which is something the project's Tibetan collaborators bring on board. The project has worked closely with Dr. Tsetan, the Dalai Lama's personal physician and director of Delek Hospital, as well as with staff from the Tibetan medicine clinic, Mense Kong.
When it first began, we did a few Tukdam cases with my staff in Delek Hospital. Then I thought, if there is a way to connect, Buddhist medical science and Western science, Mense Kong should be the partner, There's a very major cultural factor in this, I think, And also having to deal with Tukdam subjects is a very sensitive problem issue. So unless we have people who have some standing in the community as a medical doctor or being of the same culture, Tibetan, it helps to relate much better to people who, at a time of loss, wouldn't want to deal with any other person easily.
This one should last a long time. You're only having it on for a few minutes. You don't have to leave it on the whole session.
And do you have any kind of device to read the false smell?
Smell. I'm glad you asked that question. I have been doing some reading lately on it's like gas spectrometry and trying to see what it would be like to get something like that for the field. And I will let you know as soon as I do.
Nitrogen level, whatever, the gas released from the body.
Yeah. How do we begin?
Tukdam shusha sene tambo nganzu pagene permission longur nganzu gi process chidang de re teni the kunzu gi degrees and permission tena ana nganzu tuyor data collection che dipa Dr. Richard Davidson pranzu gi pagela university la
But we did get a good interview with the students.
It's okay.
Chilugi tanda shisha laitila nganzu karishi gore chungwa rakba kabas shimes still dying nganzu oti shigo tene modern science thone death ra tadi nganzu lebe lega chigi mebade khelenge hore niga chipare 닝기 첼레 가바데 니가 찍바래 테네 uk 가바데 찍바 켈링겨 modern science 소아리바 테네 낭베 따둑 군주 숨바 찍바 찍장 시겨 딜라 케바 요마레 이네 만수기 딜라 death 라고 요마레 modern science 기 디시차레스 타주고로 디레 다 군주 시차레레 타주에 된 간주 치신바레스
We're going to start this. R for perimortem and P for postmortem, including.
It's worth pointing out that in the Tibetan medical system and the Tibetan Tantras, they have very well developed explanations for what's going on with Tukdam. And as one of the researchers either already said or is about to say, what happens as you progress through the process of Tukdam matches those descriptions that are being provided by the Tibetan medical system and the Tantras. So the Tibetan medical system was and is, in my understanding, a blending of traditional Chinese medicine, of the Indian tantric medical systems and some of the, I think, Hindu medical systems, and a bit of the Persian medical system. In my humble understanding, and I'm not an expert on Tibetan medicine, at some point in Tibetan history, these various medical knowledge systems came together, the primary driving force being the Buddhist Indian tantric medical models. And those have then been added to by the Tibetans in relative isolation from the rest of the world for, I don't know, the better part of 800 or 1,000 years. And that tradition remains unbroken. So there are people who are still fully trained and fully propagating that system. Unlike many other traditional medical systems, this one has survived in its full form.
Because we think we'll talk about, because part of that is
you told us some of that. Tama de la chiva se.
Sorry, we had a little buffering there.
Tama de la chiva se. Chiva se di sem se di ya mi sangma de chargyor. Mi sangma de chargyor. Misu chongba ne chargyor. 이네 디네 갑라 치와베세티 뮤스베치고고르 야 디치와요세레도 와스네 디 뮤스신체 디 땡라 디네 냠내치니 데데데라 디네 tukdam shukwa sewa.
So, pointing out once again, if you listen to his description, it matches what the Dalai Lama said. It matches what I've described up to this point. A dying person goes through the dissolution of their 5 external senses, the dissolution of their ordinary human mind, and then experiences various other appearances. That I think we lost them during the buffering, but the appearance of white light, red or pinkish light, sometimes orangish light, black, and then the clear light appearance. And then he says, when you rest in that clear light appearance, and you hold your mind in meditation on that clear light appearance, which has these non-dual properties, i.e., you are existing in that condition as the meditation rather than actively doing something, then you're in Tukdam meditation. That for you, that is Tukdam meditation. That's what's happening for you. You have no idea at that point that you have a body and all this other stuff is going on and researchers are doing stuff, right? For you, that's Tukdam. From the outside, there's a sensation of warmth that stays around the heart. The body doesn't decay. And for other people, that's Tukdam, right? They're looking at you and your body is not going through the normal process of decay, and there's warmth around your heart and so forth. And until your consciousness departs, that unusual condition of your body will go on.
Basically, the core description that we get is they meditate on the clear light at the moment of death, and then they don't die all the way. And what you see from the outside is that the heart stops and the breathing stops, but the body stays warm, especially around the heart, for a long period of time. So for heartbeat, there's 2 obvious ways of measuring heartbeat. One of them is you put electrodes on the chest, and the other one is you use one of those finger clip things. So we have both of those. For respiration, there are 2 main ways of measuring respiration. One of them is you put a belt around the rib cage, and the other one is a capnograph, where you have a tube that picks up the gas and sees that you're breathing. And then we had 2 ways of measuring warmth, and one of them was a thermometer probe that you would tape on somewhere, or you use this thermal camera, which has to look at the exposed skin. So then we get to the really complicated part that we spent a lot of time going in and out of it, which is this brain stuff. You know, when you're neuroscientists, then you come in and you put an EEG on it, and then you see what it looks like. And then we have these other things about the decomposition, which at first we thought was an unambiguously physical prediction, but then after talking to the people who are actually the experts on the physiology of death, we learned that under normal circumstances, there's an enormous amount of variability in how bodies decompose.
There are cases where the body has remained without decomposing for quite a long period of time. In certain cases, up to 16 or 17 days, in conditions where it's quite hot in terms of the ambient temperature, tropical, where you'd expect decomposition to clearly occur at a faster rate. So,
and to briefly add on to that, tropical conditions means more ambient moisture. Tropical conditions means heat. Tropical conditions means insects. So a human body that isn't being protected in some way should be undergoing a fairly rapid, should be on the more rapid end of the decomposition schedule for a human body. And the upper limit of what has been seen with Tukdam practitioners is is not 16 or 17 days. As I pointed out in the beginning, there are Tukdam practitioners who remain in Tukdam from time to time for almost 40 days. So it's even more radical. The body should be in those conditions skeletonized or very advanced on the schedule for decomposition, and yet remains as if the person has just died within a few hours. So yeah, let's continue.
We consider that to be unusual. Whether it's within this normal range or not, we really can't say at this point in time.
We have the questionnaire about his mental clarity, and then a little bit about his practice history, and then what brought him to this life of retreat.
tawa tajiriam selen jwa andu tane seno to dega marwa sike sa seno to dene selen jwa yete matan jogumandi so lo ilane deisen.
So once again, you can see they're building up these profiles for meditators who may enter Tukdam after they pass away.
This must be from the living practitioner.
Right. This is from Living Retreat, and we were working with most recently. And so this is what we still have to work on getting the graphs here, but we're getting the.
This is the mismatch negativity.
Mismatch negativity.
Yeah. What's the difference between these two standards?
So the red would be the deviant, the green is standard, and the black is the difference wave, and it's being plotted in the negative here.
Yeah. One strategy is to sample a very large number of people when they're still alive. Then we can classify them post hoc. We'll have one group that went into Tukdam, another group which did not. We can go back to their pre-death, to their living signals, and apply machine learning algorithms, for example, and see if there are any patterns which distinguish the individuals who go on to Tukdam versus those who do not. And then we can interrogate those patterns and see what the differences are. What is the difference in the brain of a person who, when he or she dies, goes into Tukdam compared to when they do not?
When someone dies in Tukdam, it's important to start recording data as soon as possible. However, the distances in India are great, and the deaths often occur in remote areas, so it can take days for the team to reach the bodies. There are also cultural reasons for delays.
Within the Tibetan tradition, it's customary to wait 3 days after someone has died before you begin moving ahead with cremation. But at that point, you would also know whether or not somebody is in Tukdam. And so oftentimes people will not reach out to us until that third day.
That is an important, albeit minor point. I want you to recall when we first started the video we looked at the normal decomposition schedule for a human being. When you start making that transition from day 3 to day 10, the human body begins to go through a radical process of transformation from a body that more or less looks like a dead body to a dead body that is breaking down in pretty horrific ways. So often, because of this cultural notion that even a normal person's mind may, to some small degree, have components of it that remain in the body for about 3 days after death, the Tibetans won't really consider it to be extraordinary unless, let's say that person's sitting up in meditation, for example, that this person's body hasn't started to decay yet. An ordinary person's body may still be relatively normal by day 2 or 3, depending upon the environmental conditions. And so if they're sort of waiting to see if signs of decay are beginning or not before they take the next steps with that body. So the researchers are getting there quite often on days 4, 5, 6, as you saw in the other video, sometimes day 10 or 11. And so that makes the cases that they end up studying, on the one hand, more remarkable because decomposition has been delayed by so long. But on the other hand, what those researchers would really love to see, I think, is those first 3 hours. What happens during the first few days with the brain and any other data they can collect in terms of what's happening with maybe the way the heat leaves the body or whatever. And so that's something that, at least at this time, the researchers haven't been able to gain access to.
When we collect EEG data, we do 2 auditory protocols to ascertain whether or not there's some activity. Increasingly, the 2 types of auditory stimuli we're using are proving to be diagnostic and assessment tools across a range of minimally conscious states, coma, vegetative states. The contention is that, at least for a time after death, there's some residual brain activity, some activity, residual brain activity in the brainstem that's responsible for the integration of the body. In the absence of that, then we have a different question and becomes another challenging question. Well, if there is no low-level residual activity in the brainstem in those who are observing in the state of Tukdam, then how do we explain this delay in decomposition?
The modern science ki thande shimju chidang chero, thande shimju chidang nga deba khangamdo. Jumzen karin sena thande modern science ki capable dezo call kargiore ti brain wave la touch cheyore. Brain wave ti touch cheyon digala brain wave ti ngaju khelenge yo mare ka sare. Chik koran jogi thanda chingwa la karche dila ditidwa skin temperature lan tisha. Tati kande na mission ta nganju she di ninga shegyo. Ningi nanglola che yodame ningi nanglola tene namshi thamodi lega chigi tu mento titaya mado ti skin gi temperature digi thukdam digi nechu ji len tu ayo.
To briefly comment on that as well, this is something you see very often in general when you're studying anything that's from a religious standpoint. Quite often the team on the scientific end, in my humble view, doesn't take enough time to try to understand what the claims of the specific structure of the claims are for the phenomenon. And they don't take enough time to try to understand the system that gives rise to those particular claims. So as a result of this, they end up with methodological issues in terms of data collection. I do humbly disagree with that gentleman regarding brain scans. I think it's an important null hypothesis, for example, to do brain scans and determine if there's brain activity at a low level. throughout the entire Tukdam period. You know, if it's 37 days, is the brainstem still active and doing something, for example? I think is something worth interrogating. But he makes an excellent point in that the specific claim made by Tukdam, as in terms of the systems it comes out of, is not that the brain stays active, it's that the subtle winds and the mind have moved to the heart, and they are abiding there, and that there are at least differences that can be detected, for example, with the instrument of the human body, right? If you put your hand over it, you have a sensation of warmth in your hand. And as they're about to say, well, I won't give it away, but you know, they're going to interrogate whether or not there's actual heat in the body at that location or not. But he's saying, you know, if you're measuring skin temperature under their arm, how are you going to tell if there's heat, for example, deep in the chest cavity? Maybe there's a small point of heat there that makes no difference by the time it diffuses and gets to the level of the skin. So how would you know? Well, you'd have to do more invasive types of measurements that probably the tradition itself and the people involved wouldn't allow you to do. So then you run into these methodological problems. So on the one hand, I agree, probably measuring temperature under the arm and maybe even measuring skin temperature on the surface of the skin, it may not be sufficient heat being generated there, that it could be measured in that way. And in particular, if it's not heat at the level of vibration of physical particles and instead is just an accumulation of these sub-physical substances like wind that you detect as heat when you put your hand over it, that's not going to be picked up by sort of conventional scan looking for temperature, because that's not what it is. It's basically some type of substance that is associated with consciousness that if you refine it and compact it and make it more substantial, that other people, when they detect it, it is detected by their system as warmth or some kind of electrical energy, right? Again, in my humble opinion, I'm not sure that we have the scientific instruments to study that at this point, because every study that's attempted to look at those things, despite the fact that even the scientists involved will tell you, yes, we did feel those things were real, we did have these sensations, blah, blah, blah. They'll say we have no idea how it works, and we couldn't detect anything different. So, yes. Okay, let us continue on. So earlier I was talking about the subtle body. This is a diagram from the Tibetan perspective of the subtle body. So this is a sub-physical structure through which the winds channel inside the body.
Around the heart. And there were 4 cases during the time that I was involved. And we only got clear thermal imaging data one of the times, and they were stone cold. That, you know, you could see very clearly in the thermal imaging that there's the wall and then the body, and everything is all the same color. There was no variation whatsoever. And every day, a group of devotees would come in and would carefully inspect the person, and they would feel carefully with the back of their hand, and they would be commenting on it, and then they would agree that the person was still in Tukdam. The hardest to explain is if all these people they're not crazy at all, they are in fact legitimately putting their hand there, and they really sincerely are experiencing the feeling of it being warmer than it should be. And the camera is not malfunctioning, and it really is definitely showing that from the point of view of physics, the thermal vibratory energy is the same in the body and the wall.
And it's important to note also that, yes, you could say, well, it's psychosomatic on the part of the practitioners. However, there are all of these other signs that occur when the consciousness leaves. And actually, from their perspective, is if this is one of their teachers, of course, they have an incredibly respectful attitude towards their teachers. They're not going to make stuff up about their teacher. That would be like completely unfathomable to them. It would be breaking a huge number of vows they hold religiously and so forth, first of all. But secondly, the inclination actually would not be to lie and say, oh yeah, my teacher spent 30 days in Tukdam. Isn't that extraordinary? Because from the Tibetans' perspective, if your teacher spent 2 days in Tukdam and then immediately left to carry on benefiting other beings rather than staying in Tukdam a long time, that would be an indication that their mind was even more capable, even more powerful. So the pressure would be not to extend the time they were in Tukdam by pretending or psychosomatically, generating the feeling, oh, I feel warmth in my hand, and oh, yes, my teacher stayed in this state for so long, look how incredible they are. That's actually not the claim of the system. The claim of the system is you're not as good a practitioner if you had to spend more time in this state. Yes, you do want to spend time in this state. Yes, it's incredibly beneficial, but advanced practitioners only spend, sometimes as little as 1 day, 3 days, 5 days, and then they go because they need to carry on the work of benefiting sentient beings. They can't just sit there in this incredible state that's great for them. So I think the instinct, especially amongst those who are quite skeptical, might be, well, oh yeah, they're just they just make it up in their heads. But again, this is one sign of a number of signs, like the skin staying pliant and the fluids not leaving the body and there being no smell of decomposition. This is one of a number of signs that Tukdam is ongoing. And these signs sort of go away together, right? Where the warmth goes away and the fluids start to come out and the body starts to smell and decomposition. The body becomes slack and the skin loses its elasticity. These signs are going away around the same time. And once again, the inclination would not be to try to extend the time that your precious root guru, who means everything to you, spent in this state by making stuff up. The inclination would be to have them spend less time in Tukdam. So, yeah, I think it's important to have all these factors in mind when these kinds of statements are being made.
When the Tibetan tradition talks about Tukdam, they don't have thermal imaging cameras. So when they say the body stays warm, the specific statement that the tradition is making is that when you touch the body around the heart, you experience the feeling of warmth. Everything that I've ever experienced is completely consistent with the idea that people experience Tukdam exactly the way the tradition says that people experience Tukdam. Nothing that I've observed has contradicted that at all. Just the more time that I spent on this project, the more striking was the contrast between, as long as you weren't trying to do a whole bunch of hard science with equipment, everything looked one way. And then as soon as you start bringing the equipment in and trying to nail everything down and take a bunch of physical measurements, then it all falls apart.
So that's the end of part 2. And I'm not sure that I need to summarize anything. We'll just go right ahead and jump into part 3.
Several medical doctors interviewed for this documentary reported feeling warmth around the heart area of deceased monks said to be in Tukdam. These included doctors who looked after the 16th Karmapa, one of the most important Tibetan spiritual leaders of the 20th century. He died in Tukdam in a hospital in Zion, Illinois, outside Chicago.
There was no respirations, no sign of air. The eyes were just beginning to dilate, the pupils. So clinically dead. And then they prepared, and then about an hour and a half later, then they called me into the room to feel above the heart. And the area was warm. It was really warm, I remember that.
the area around his heart, when you felt it, put your hand on his chest, still felt warm for the first 2 to 3 days after he died, which obviously from a Western point of view is not consistent with what we would expect. And then beyond that, he did begin to look better after he died. His color was better. His face almost filled out in an odd way, and his body was really strong looking and vibrant in a way that was very striking to me.
I think one important highlight from what was just said was in particular for that second doctor. The first doctor said that he felt a lot of heat around the heart after about 90 minutes of passing away. And the human body, I think, in the research that I've done very briefly preparing for this, loses heat over the course of about 24 hours. And this is one of those things, depending on the, again, ambient temperature, blah, 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 that criminal investigators will use to determine how long ago someone passed away. So I think within 90 minutes, you're still within the range where there could be sort of normal human temperature there, you know? But one human putting their hand over another human who's been deceased for 90 minutes, that body should begin to feel slightly colder than yours. So it may still be warm, potentially, but it would at that point be beginning to be colder than a normal human body, in my understanding of the issue. What he said specifically was it felt really warm, that area felt really warm, which I think would be unusual. Even more interesting and important, I think, was the second gentleman's statement where he said that 2 or 3 days later, when he came in and put his hand over the heart of the Karmapa, who is indeed, was the 16th Karmapa of the Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, was an incredible practitioner by all accounts. That when he, after 2 or 3 days, put his hand over the heart area, it was still warm. And that specific statement and claim would be, as he said, extremely unusual and unexpected. So it's nice to see some people that, insofar as we know, don't practice Tibetan Buddhism and don't have any vested interest in the subject, having the same claim as the faithful practitioners, yes? The faithful practitioners say you put your hand there and you will have a sensation of warmth in your hand. And 2 doctors are saying the exact same thing.
For me personally, it's hard to explain, except to say that, you know, there must be some ability of an individual or some unintended ability of an individual's, you know, capability of somehow delaying some sort of a metabolic process or a natural process that we all undergo of degradation, you know. And how that's done in terms of its mechanism, I can't really figure out. But to me, it seems that there is some control by something over the physical world, basically. It kind of defies that. But then it comes down to the issue of whether one believes in a consciousness or a mind that travels from one state to the next state, leaving the physical body. Some sort of a subtle state, you know, that science has yet to discover, basically, that is capable of doing something like this. There's definitely a mind over matter control there. That's what I'm trying to get at, I think, you know.
When you consider this mind over matter component that he's talking about, really what he's pointing to is that if it was just the brain, according to everything that we understand about the brain currently, it's a very small, very short window in which the brain can do any kind of coordinated conscious activity once you stop breathing and the heart stops. In my, again, humble, only somewhat informed understanding, when your heart stops and the brain stops getting nutrients and oxygen, the brain, I think, can only carry on with coordinated activities for something like 30 seconds or 90 seconds. It's not like your muscles, which can go without some of their nutrients and so forth by doing other things for a relatively long period of time. You know, like when you go to sleep and you wake up and your leg is asleep, for example. So some of your other nerves and some of your muscles and so forth can operate fairly well without nutrients for some period of time. You can take the other organs out of the body, put them on ice, transport them, and transplant them in someone else. You have a few hours to do that. But the brain basically can't produce enough coordinated firings for you to have any kind of conscious experience that is even recognizable as anything we would understand as a conscious experience, according to neuroscience. Again, this is my understanding of the issue. So what he's saying is, either there is an intentional or unintentional way in which these practitioners are somehow overcoming this physical limit because the brain has stopped the breathing, the brain is showing no activity according to the research, the heart has stopped and the breathing has stopped. So somehow they're either still intentionally doing this or they've done something unintentional which simply stops their body from decaying. And I'm not going to pull the article up, but I am going to say this very briefly. When you look at some of you may be thinking, well, yes, but what about those mummies? What about the Buddhist mummies, for example, that you find in Russia, or you find in certain parts of Tibet, or you find in Japan? Each of these has its own sort of roots coming down through history, and there are specific mummification practices that are used in some Buddhist traditions where they are preserving a dead body and making it not lifelike, but more lifelike, let's say, to preserve that body for the sake of the devotees being able to do certain types of practice or what have you in relation to that body. So those are real things. In regards to the Japanese mummies, if my understanding is correct, I think, someone may need to correct me on this, but I think the Japanese mummies come from the Tendai sect of Japanese Tantric Buddhism, and that is actually a deliberate physical process of transformation where the practitioner spends about 3 years consuming substances that begin to mummify their body while they're still alive, and then goes through a very intensive process at the very end of their life where they just finish the purging process and sit in a meditative state, and the body becomes a mummy in a seated position. But they've done a huge amount of work to stop the body from going through its normal decay process before they died. Just a huge amount of work, right? So that's quite different than what's happening here. And that would be to call that unintentionally keeping the body in a condition, I think would be going too far. But insofar as we know, and insofar as I've heard from my teachers, there's no specific stuff they're doing around the time of their death that causes this to happen. That, you know, they carry on with their ordinary activities. Some of them go to the hospitals and get regular medical care. They're doing their practices. They're eating or not according to the way that healthy and unhealthy people eat or not at the end of their lives. They're living in a relatively conventional way, considering that they're great yogis and practitioners, right? So what he's pointing to there with unintentional mummification, temporary mummification or something, would be, for example, if you could find some common behavior between them that somehow causes their body to not decay. Like, is there a special tea they're drinking, or it's a special Tibetan medicine that all of them take, or is there something that they're doing physically that stops them from decaying for a period of time? And then who knows, when the bacteria break that down in their gut or whatever, then at that point the system kicks off and does its normal thing. you know, these are the sorts of questions. But suffice it to say, there are probably, I don't know, 5,000 or 10,000 people doing Tummo and Powa and general tantric generation and completion stage practices who don't enter Tukdam and decay on a completely normal schedule. So if it were simply the practices themselves that did this because they did something to you physically that is radically counterintuitive, then we would expect that quite a few more people who were just doing these practices intensively at a physical level and a mental level would also not decay, right? And yet they do. So yeah, these are important questions to ask and to clear the air with, but in the end, I think, once again, having now, I think they're on year 12 or 13 of this study, and they still haven't found some alternative explanation. So here we are.
The Tukdam project also includes anthropological investigation into the Tibetan Buddhist theories, practices, and ways of life that produce Tukdam. An expert meditator in his high Himalayan retreat has agreed to an interview with Dylan.
ini chisem tamo katewa ini ripatendo sim taru doadang 동반이 가시기 줄로 가시라 ini 에셀라기를 가시라 동반이서 또 나와지면 또 여말 동반이서 쑥 줘야 여말에 나와지간라 또 되고 그래서라다.
So mind becomes totally empty. 동바지 갈때 돼.
다 된대 동상대.
Remains in the mind remains in empty.
다 열세대 간데 되대 그래서 열세대 간.
Emptiness or strage.
So when someone pronounces death, if they're in Tukdam, the heart is not active, but there's still, the body is preserved in a way. Why does the skin stay supple? Why is the face radiant? How is that connection, that little mind, that subtle mind?
인자 뒤에 수부 정말 캬대게 소런데 인기를 다 셔놓고 쓰고 말와 이나야 디기디당 이네 된다 셈디 대대어와 셈디 대어자 셈디 슈기 주니 셈셈스는 룽레 대어다 셈당 룽이다 직바지고 와라다 룽셈 직바직지고 와래 어때 팀제찬이 셈디 슈 첨부지어자 디기 누투 이네 디기 질라 이네 띵예지 다 망보직라 제 망보직라 때는 이 루스와 전에 대만도 섬기도 쓸란다.
I'd like to highlight once again that this great meditator in the Gelug traditions, living in retreat, doing practice for the last 20 years, and the explanation he's providing is once again that every level of consciousness has these subtler sub-physical energies associated with them. Again, energy I don't really like, but these sub-physical, basically material substances that aren't made of ordinary matter associated with them. And he's saying that part of what makes you alive is that these substances, these sub-physical substances, are in the body. And therefore, when the mind comes to rest at the heart center with some of these sub-physical substances associated with it that can't be pulled apart or taken out of that conscious state, while it's resting there in a state of concentration at the heart center, remember the diagram where you have the heart center with all the channels running through it to the different parts of the body, that because that sub-physical substance which makes you alive is still there and present in the body, but not in all of the myriad forms that it comes to exist in when you're fully alive. Otherwise, you'd be fully alive, right? And again, the Tibetans have very sophisticated descriptions of all the different kinds of winds and how they're associated with different types of conscious states and vision and hearing and blah, 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 right? and the different organs in the body, etc. So obviously not all of those winds are present, but some of them are present. And so the body isn't yet dead, actually. It has stopped the functioning of a huge number of things because those winds associated with those parts of the body are no longer functioning. But the body itself isn't fully dead because the mind is still abiding with some of those energies in the heart center of the body. So again, there's pretty, it may seem unusual from a cultural perspective where we don't have a model like this to talk about this stuff, but there are pretty sophisticated descriptions of why this stuff works. And to tie it back to the earlier discussion, we have physical indications like practices of Tummo, practices of Powa, etc., that give an indication, at least, if not prove. Prove is a strong word if you're talking about scientific proof, but give an indication, at least, that working with whatever these substances are you can feel when you do these types of practices, working with those really does produce effects in the real world. And one of the effects it produces in the real world, in this case, is that the body doesn't decay until you decide to leave your body.
After decades of studies in monastic colleges, this monk has spent over 20 years in isolated meditation retreat. He embodies a system of knowledge arising from a cultural and historical background very different to ours. Here, meditative experience also informs views about consciousness and its subtler aspects said to be separate from the brain. This is what reincarnates, continuing from one life to the next. Tukdam makes sense within this Tibetan system of knowledge, but has proved challenging for science with its own cultural assumptions.
It's probably pretty clear to everyone now, but only gradually became clear to us, that just all these questions of the cultural differences and, the different views of like what is medicine and what is the body and how does the body relate to the mind and things like that are really just very deeply culturally different. And a lot of the cultural differences were the ones that are actually the foundation of Western science. So it was a scientific project that only made sense in the context of being able to understand the cultural construction of science itself. But you can't, like, part of the whole thing about cultural constructions is that you can't understand them from inside of them. Because when you're inside of them, then you're just inhabiting them. So it was very jarring to deal with it all, because it was really more an anthropology project with a neuroscience component rather than a neuroscience project, period.
A big part of my PhD work was on philosophy of science. So not many people know this about the history of science, but it began as a form of philosophy. And roughly speaking, as it evolved and we got into some of the later thinkers in terms of trying to conceptualize what science is and what it is not, what some of the early thinkers in science said, for example, and I'm going to spare you quoting everyone, in part because I can't remember all their names at the moment, but some of the early fathers of scientific thought and scientific theorization were, for example, that psychic phenomenon, as an example, might be real. Those might be real. But if you're doing science, what you would need to prove that a psychic event had occurred, for example, would need to be the types of evidence that is open to scientific study. In other words, let's say that psychic phenomenon, like reading someone's thoughts, is a real thing, that you can become aware of another person's thoughts, not through empathy or the ordinary process of of observation, but through direct mind-to-mind contact. Okay, let's say that was a real thing. If that were a real thing and you were doing science, some of the early fathers of science said, we're not rejecting that outright. What we're saying instead is that if we're doing science, the method we're using methodologically as a system of accumulating knowledge is we're only looking at stuff we can access through the physical aspects of whatever has occurred. So we're going to build instruments, we're going to design experiments to look at only the aspects of reality that are accessible to that type of physical material measurement. And this approach has been extraordinarily successful in improving the technologies with which we live and our understandings of ourselves through things like neurology and neurobiology and biology and medicine, etc. It's an extraordinarily successful, beneficial method. But I would argue, as have many others, including people like Chalmers, that there are aspects of human experience that aren't actually open to scientific investigation because they don't occur in the phenomena themselves that are being measured don't occur in the physical world in the same sense as my cup occurs in the physical world. If I hold this cup here, anybody who happens to be in the room can see it. The camera can pick it up, and later a screen can produce an image of it. But now, if I visualize my cup, and I'm visualizing it right here, only I get to see it. And if I flick it, I can hear it. If I drink tea out of it, I can taste it. It has a tactile sensation. For me, I'm not saying that's a physical object. Obviously, the teacup that is now right here is not a physical thing. But this has properties that I can experience. This mental object has properties I can experience that nobody else gets to experience, that no instrument that we have come up with in science can measure. You can't measure this cup, and it has no ordinary physical properties. So there are aspects of experience, for example, that aren't accessible to the scientific method. And I would argue, at least at this stage, that whatever these seemingly sub-physical substances are that are involved in Taoist Neidan, Hindu Tantra, Buddhist Tantra, etc., that these types of subtler physical substances are among those things that, at least at this time, we don't have the instruments to measure. It may turn out that there are ways to measure those things, but at this time, it doesn't seem like whatever these things are made up of the same particles that make up everything else. And these winds or substances that come along with consciousness are in the same way as my cup. You know, the cup I'm imagining is imaginary, but these aren't imaginary. When you look for them, you find them there. And when you do things with them, real stuff happens to your body and mind, not imaginary stuff, including things like Tukdam. Yeah? Okay, let's carry on.
Dr. Tumdam, Dr. Sutton, welcome. Welcome the rest of the team. I know things have been busy, so I'm just going to jump right in to the research. There's much more we can go over, but I want to give the highlights of what we have, okay? I'll skip this a little bit because they're here. So then what I decided to do was to try and compare the healthy subjects that we have with the actual Tukdam data. And so this is an example. You can see there's not much that's happening for the red line, the Tukdam line, but we're getting a real clear signal for the practitioner.
I think that the way we have moved around in terms of the last 7 years, the approach hasn't been effective enough. To me, from my understanding of His Holiness's hope of this project, really is to have some proof that there is some sort of consciousness or a mental or a mind continuum that goes on beyond this life, basically. The only first kindergarten step
is really to say, is there a difference between a gross mind and a subtle mind?
We cannot prove rebirth. We cannot prove mind. We cannot prove subtle mind. What we can do is look at the effects of those practices on the body that are unusual and that Western science.
So did you hear what he said there? It's the same problem that I was pointing to. Western science is set up to use various physical means of measurement to extend our ordinary five senses, to help us infer things that exist that can't be detected, for example, or to extend our senses, our sense of touch, our sense of vision, our sense of hearing, etc., to extend those beyond the normal human range so that we can, roughly speaking, directly see through that instrument. You know, like with a microscope, you extend the ability of your visual observation to be able to see very small things. With a telescope, you extend your visual ability to see things that are very far away, right? So we use instruments to gather physical data points about physical objects, be them large or small. And if there are things that aren't physical, that affect physical things, right, which would be, roughly speaking, would be my claim, or would seem to be the Buddhist claim more generally, then the best science can do is look for the ways that those things affect physical reality, and then look for the mechanisms by which those things are occurring in physical reality. And the answer might be we can't find a mechanism to explain why this should occur, and that points to there being something else behind it. And you may be sitting there thinking, yeah, but isn't that just sort of like succumbing to some weird spiritual thing? Or, you know, isn't that just saying there's no explanation? Well, no, not really. If you look at something like dark matter and dark energy, we and I mean, mathematicians do this quite regularly too, where you just can't figure out some part of why the system works in the way that it does. And so you put in dark energy. We don't know what it is, but we know it has these kinds of properties because in the rest of reality, we see X, Y, and Z happening. And then you work on trying to explain it and describe it and make a model that makes sense out of it. So in the case of Indian meditators and Tibetan meditators and so forth, and similar practices from Hinduism and Neidan in Chinese Taoism and so forth, the data, in a sense, is the observations that are taking place for these things are being done by great meditators of pretty rarefied levels of skill. And, you know, if you and I were to train in these methods that produce these sorts of things for 5 or 10 years, we would begin to have these things happen to us also. I mean, I know of people who are doing similar practices that are like some of the things we've talked about today, in terms of Tummo, etc., for way less time than that, you know, going from no meditative experience to jumping right into some of these kinds of practices. And they have reported some of the signs that I would expect from Tibetan tantric practice, like seeing light and some of these other things. So having said all of that, you can see that there's the cultural battle happening here, where on the Tibetan side, they're saying, you know, what we're trying to do is basically show, roughly speaking, that the components making up the model, that there's a mind that isn't in the brain, that mind is at the level of the heart, and that it's generating heat there, et cetera, et cetera. We're trying to show that this is something that's really happening and that those things are real. And this gentleman here is saying, actually, we can't even go that far in science. What I could do is to say, well, for example, there's heat in the heart, if we could gather that data. What we could do is show that there's no brain activity. And then it becomes a big puzzle as to why a body wouldn't break down on the normal decomposition schedule if there's no brain activity, no breathing, no heartbeat, right? That doesn't yet prove that, you know, I'm speaking with his voice now, that doesn't yet prove that your claim about why that's happening is true, but it eliminates one possibility that from a neurological, ordinary scientific perspective needs to be eliminated for us to even go forward with the conversation. So you can see these two systems begin to sort of, in terms of what they're aiming at, bumping heads a little bit. Anyways, I hope this is interesting. You know, the philosophy of science is really fantastic and makes sense out of debates like this, but more importantly, it's critical to know what science is trying to do and what it's not trying to do and what its limits are. And if the substances that you're moving around with practices like Tummo, and if the substances that collect at the heart when you're doing Tukdam practice, etc., are not actually physical material substances made of particles, it may in fact be the case that those are things that can never be measured sufficiently with science to say that they are real. What may instead be possible is to show that something is definitely going on in the body, in the regions being described, etc., that is unusual and currently lacks an explanation, like dark matter, dark energy. And then scientists it would behoove them to try to come up with some explanation to describe why that occurs. And, you know, 50 years from now, maybe that explanation is something different than what the Tibetan Buddhists came up with and the Indians came up with. Or, you know, maybe it's beginning to converge with a more traditional kind of explanation. We don't know, you know. Anyways, that's kind of what he's getting to here.
Medical science doesn't have a good explanation for. With the EEG approach, it has to be within this first few hours. Even if we get informed of 12 Tukdam in the next month, if we're only knowing about it day 5, it's not going to change anything.
No matter how much we study with this, even within 6 hours, I think the chances that the EEG will show that actually very, very good. I think, this is my feeling. Because person is dead. For all purposes, the person is dead. The subtle mind is so deep down. Because I can't even think of a day when you can really kind of pinpoint it with some sort of machine.
After a decade of research, Richard Davidson's team published a null finding. They have not found brain activity in Tukdam subjects so far. The research effort continues. A team associated with the Russian Academy of Sciences and Moscow State University have also started studying Tukdam and are now collaborating with Davidson.
Maybe such sort of research work even sort of may take generations. Okay, but worthwhile to make some research. It's something factor, some factor, some fact, right? Oh, so one phenomena, something mysterious, is really worthwhile to investigate.
So really at kind of the most fundamental levels, this work can begin to raise questions about the ultimate nature of consciousness and where that might come from. And these are some of the most profound and deepest questions in philosophy and science today. And in many ways, this relates to what philosophers have called the hard problem, which is how is it that experience, subjective experience, can arise from the material matter of the brain. And I think that if we're honest with ourselves, really deeply honest, I don't think that we've made much progress on that question in the last 100 years. And this work relates to that issue and begins to ask different kinds of questions about it and raises the question of perhaps there might not be a complete identity between the mind and the brain. Clearly, they're intimately related. Exactly how they're related, nobody really knows if we're really honest, I think, with our observations.
That's it. So from here, I believe we're rolling credits, but I don't want someone to say later that I cut something off, and so we'll get to the credits here. Right. So that is the film on Tukdam, and I titled this video, "Is Death Really the End?" because, at least at this stage, what the Tukdam research project has shown is that regardless of the what this research has shown is that insofar as we can tell, there's no brain activity left at all in practitioners doing Tukdam. At least at this stage of the research, no brain activity. And so therefore, it's not the brain that's keeping the body alive somehow. The people who are actually in Tukdam are declared quite often clinically dead by medical professionals, and they remain clinically dead for 3 days before any of this research is performed on them, and their bodies are not decaying on the normal schedule for decomposition for bodies. So if we are to believe the Tibetan Buddhist explanation, there is a subtler form of consciousness that is below the five senses, below the ordinary human awareness of your own mind in your waking state, below the level of dreaming, below the level of dreamless sleep, below the level of being unconscious, completely unconscious. So there is a basal level, a very floor, foundational level of consciousness that is called clear light. And that in this condition of clear light that naturally occurs at the time of death, that an advanced practitioner who has trained very, very hard to be able to hold their mind in that condition at the time of death can remain in the heart center, along with the subtle physical substances, the winds that go along with that mind. And because that mind has not yet left the body, although the body is deceased in every ordinary sense, because the winds associated with all the other functions of the body and mind have stopped, the body doesn't decay because the mind hasn't left and these fundamental winds associated with that mind have not left the body. So this would be, I think, at least an indication, a relatively good indication, that death is probably not the end. If all of these clinical signs of death can occur and the person, let's say, the continuum of consciousness, can retain control and not allow the body to decay and doesn't simply go out of existence when the brain has completely turned off for 10 days, that's a strong indication that consciousness isn't just the brain and probably does carry on to do something else after this life. Yeah. Also, it's not going to be covered in this video. I'll probably do another one, but there's also a huge amount of research on the other side, children with past life memories. Children with past life memories very often have, or not very often, but sometimes have memories from the in-between period. So you've died, the mind has left the body, and then there's an in-between period, and then you enter the womb, and then you are reborn. And some of these kids have memories of the in-between period as well as their previous life. So we'll talk at some point about that as well. If people are interested, put some comments down below. I am trying to move into doing this full time, so please like, subscribe, offer some support using the GoFundMe or whatever lives down there at the time that you're watching this video. And that will allow me to make more content and to carry on trying to do this full time so that I can bring you, hopefully, these very interesting and beneficial experiences. Thanks for coming. Hope to see you again very soon. Cheers.